Hi students, I am Dr. K. Kobal Sadish Kumar, working as an associate professor in the Department of Pharmacology. Today, my topic is spare receptors concept. Before going to the topic, first we need to know what is the receptors. Receptor is a proteinous substance which is used for the signal transduction process. Spare receptors. Spare receptors, also known as reserve receptors, are a concept in pharmacology referring to receptors that are not occupied or activated by an agonist during a maximal biological response. In the other words, not all the receptors need to be activated to achieve the full therapeutic effect, which is known as spare receptors. This phenomenon implies that the full response can be obtained even when only a portion of the receptors are bound to by the agonist. Once again, I am repeating, spare receptors are also known as reserve receptors. In this concept, referring to a receptors that are not occupied or activated by an agonist during a maximal biological response. Like, for example, 100 receptor is there means only 10 receptors going to bind with the drug will bind to the receptor only the 10%. It will produce the maximal response, biological response. The remaining receptors are known as spare receptors. I will explain in detail about the mechanism. The mechanism of action of the spare receptors is, you can see this graph. There is receptor A and another one response A and response B. Two is there. First response is produce the 100% response in the dose occupying of the 10 particular range. Biological response is 100%, but the maximal response is produced in the minimum amount of the there are the 100 receptors means only the 15 to 10 to 15% of the receptor are occupied and produces the 100% of the response, and remaining receptors also there. This is known as the spare receptors. In mechanism, spare receptors are typically seen in systems where the receptors effector mechanism has a high efficiency. High efficiency means higher activity. For example, the first one graph you can see the maximal response 100% biological response. 100% biological response is produced in the minimum amount of the receptor, but it can produce on a high super extra response also. The remaining receptors are known as spare receptors. This means that even partial activation of the receptor can lead maximal biological response. Like only the 10% of the receptors activated and producing 100% receptor. Remaining receptors are known as spare receptors. In this system, the spare receptors, the dose effector dose not rely on the activation of every receptor, but rather on the activation of smaller subset of a receptor beyond which there are no increasing effect. Okay, you understand, I think. Next, for example, a typical example for this spare receptor is the heart muscles responses to the adrenergic agonist. Adrenergic agonist. It is the main example. Heart muscles present is the adrenergic agonist. Even if you have only a small fraction of the adrenergic receptors, 100 receptor is there means only small fractions occupied by the agonist. For example, epinephrine. These are the adrenergic system. Only the small amount of the drug occupied to the small amount of the receptors. The heart rate and forces of the contraction may be maximized. The higher changes is there due to the spare receptor because there are spare receptors present in the heart muscles. Once again, repeating, a typical example in is the heart muscles response to the adrenergic agonist. For example, epinephrine is the one of the adrenergic agonist, which is fine to the heart muscles that produces various maximized contraction, force of contraction due to availability of the spare receptors. For example, its mechanism is spare receptors exist because the signal transduction process can be amplified the effect of the receptor activation. This occurs when secondary messengers or effector proteins are involved in amplifying the initial signal, thus reducing the need for a complete receptor occupancy to produce full response. Full response will be produced. Okay, I think you are understand. Okay. Next is the characteristics of the spare receptor, various characters of the spare receptors. First one is reduced dose requirement, because if the cell is contains large amount of spare receptors, without spare receptors, only the 100% response with the occupying of the all the receptors. But with the spare receptors, minimum amount of the drug bind to the receptor and produces the maximal response, which means reduced dose requirements. Spare receptors imply that the body requires a lower concentration of the agonist to achieve the desired effect, since only a small fraction of the receptors is needed for the full activation. Therefore, lower doses of the drug can often produce maximum effect. It means lower doses of the drug can often produces the maximum effects. And also, it is main character is increased sensitivity of the receptors. The presence of the spare receptors can lead to the increase of the sensitivity of the system to this drug, meaning that even a small amount of an agonist can generate a substantial biological effect. Minimum, only a small quantity, small portion of the drug can lead to the maximal response. It means increasing the sensitivity of the receptor. Increases the sensitivity of the receptor can lead to the increases the activity, which means it presence of spare receptors. These are the main character of the spare receptors. And also we can see the clinical relevance of the spare receptors. Clinical relevance, first one is drug potency of the drug. Potency means minimum dosage. Small amount of the dose can produce the maximal response. It means potency. The spare receptors contribute to lower record of the dose. Already we seen that low dose can produce maximal response for the agonist to produce their maximal effect. For example, in some receptors, only a small portion of the receptor occupancy is needed to activate a signal cascade and produce a full therapeutic effect. For example, adrenaline, epinephrine can produce full vasoconstriction response by only finding the small portion of the adrenergic receptor, even though more receptors are available. These are the main example. Another therapeutic implications, dose adjustments and receptor sensitivity. Dose adjustments means drugs which pair receptors may require low dose, but the clinician needs to be cautious of potential toxicity at higher doses. Low dose means less toxicity, high dose means higher toxicity. Receptor sensitivity, already we seen. Receptor blockade and antagonism. The presence of the spare receptors can affect the efficacy of antagonist. In the case of competitive antagonist, a higher concentration of the antagonist may be required to overcome the effect of agonist, because the system can still respond with fraction of the receptor activation. For example, a competitive antagonist like naloxone in opioid overdose may require larger doses to fully reverse the effect, depending on the how many spare opioid receptors are involved in that particular region. Okay. Another examples are spare receptor in the body, theta-adrenergic receptor, we already seen, and also the cholinergic receptor in the heart. These are all the main receptors, uh, and also neurotransmitters in the brain. Dopamine receptors are the main receptors, main examples for the spare receptors. Okay. Okay, students. Today we see clearly about the spare receptors concept. First, just I recall you. Spare receptors are the receptors which is present in the cells. The minimum required amount of the drug can produce the maximal response. All the receptors are not occupied. Only small portion of the receptors occupied by the small portion of the drugs and produce maximal response means this concept is spare receptor concept. Okay, students, we can see in another video. Thank you. Thank you all. Bye.